Welcome to this week's podcast of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. I ended last week's podcast, and I kind of recognized sometimes the podcast was going a little long and I needed to wrap it up, but I also felt like there was a little bit more to say on the topic. And so last week we were talking about this path of natural selection to try to get us past the eye problem that Charles Darwin recognized in The Origin of Species, of how is it that we go from nothing to a fully functioning eye. And my contention was that Darwin achieved this goal by kind of starting part way up Richard Dawkins' parable of Mount Improbable, that he didn't really start at the beginning and that was problematic. Now, I've mentioned before in modern evolutionary theory, neo-Darwinian theory, it's not just the power of natural selection, which, again, by Darwin's own admission, his critics charged him with infusing natural selection with godlike powers. But it's also the combination of natural selection combined with random mutation that gets him to ultimately where he's trying to go in all of this. The question is, can random mutation actually save Charles Darwin and his theory? And my contention is the answer is no. And let's talk a little bit about why. I love when we were kids, we used to drive all over the Western United States on vacation with our parents. And inevitably, all of the things as little kids that you find entertaining, your parents do not want to stop at. Now as an adult, I recognize why, but there was somewhere out in western Kansas, there was always a sign for, stop and see a six-legged steer or the world's largest groundhog, I think, or something like that. Dad would never stop. On the way out, he would always tell us it was on the wrong side of the road, and on the way back, we were in a hurry and we were trying to get home, and we never got to stop. And my sister and I used to tease him about that for years and years and years. Turns out, I think the world's largest groundhog was like a concrete statue. And if you go online, you can find pictures of a six-legged steer. A lot of times it's an animal that has a couple of extra kind of sad-looking little legs sticking out of its back or something like that. It's what we would normally correctly identify as a random mutation. And pretty quickly, I think we could recognize it's not a helpful mutation. So, as a little kid, you look at those things, and while I always wanted to stop, I never got to, like I said. As a parent now, I kind of recognize why. But in our journey, this is going to be important because the idea of mutation, I think, has been captivated by Hollywood and comic books and things like that. And in this era of Marvel and DC and all those kinds of things, the X-Men and mutants and all of those kinds of things are tremendously fascinating to all of us, and they make for great movies. But is that the way it really works? And is that as simple as what we're talking about is going to be here? So I wanted to go through this topic, and I wanted to talk about it a little bit because natural selection on its own does not require significant change genetically to produce the effects that we see it do. And I think that's why it has such a powerful explanatory value, is because we recognize when we look at, dog breeders, especially dog breeders who are breeding certain kinds of dogs, we can tell and we can see that by taking this pet and this pet, they're able to bring out certain traits in the animals. We have a dog right now that we just dearly love. She's been the best dog that we've ever owned. But she has a slight genetic mutation that has traveled through her family tree. She has 3 toes on each of her back paws. And when we bought her from the breeder was very upfront and asked us, did we intend to show her as a dog? And we said no. And she said, okay, the reason I have to ask that question is because the dog has only 3 toes on each of its back paws. And we love it. My wife thinks it makes her that much cuter. She's our 3-toed baby. As we look at that, but she should have 4 back there. And the breeder told us that it pops up on her father's side. Every once in a while, they will get a puppy that only has 3 toes on one of its paws. And in her case, she has it on both of her back paws. But that would be an example of something we look at as a genetic mutation, that as that breeder is breeding dogs going forward, she has all the qualities we were looking for in a dog. She has the sweetest disposition in the world. She's just beautiful. She's a wonderful dog in every way, shape, and form. But I guess we can't show her professionally because she's missing a couple of toes. You can see the power of natural selection in that example, in any example where a breeder is trying to breed certain traits. And we would look at that and say, well, that's not a good trait, that's a bad trait. And a breeder would try to breed that out of the breed because it is something that's a flaw in the dog. And so in theory, that family line would eventually die out. The thing that we recognize is natural selection on its own does not require radical DNA changes to accomplish its goal. It simply requires just following through on changes that have already occurred. Some of us are taller, some of us are shorter. Red hair versus blonde hair. We see those different traits and we recognize in people and in pets and things like that, or cattle. We see how breeders will go in and breed in certain traits or how certain traits disappear over time. We recognize that, and we know that to be the case. And so there's enormous explanatory value there, and I think that's part of why Darwin's theory is so easy for us to understand and easy to gain traction. The problem becomes, as we track it back, it has explanatory value with existing species, and it has explanatory value with existing body parts and functions, but can it explain the beginnings of anything? My contention being no. And that's what Richard Dawkins in his parable of climbing Mount Improbable attempts to explain, which again, I think it's a great attempt, but I think it falls short, and we've talked about that in previous episodes. Random mutation, in theory, rides to the rescue of Darwin's theory, and random mutation supposedly shows us how if you every once in a while you have a dramatic leap forward or a dramatic change, then natural selection can grab a hold of that and carry it forward. And I think in the example of the human eye, that's what a lot of people would argue for today, is that they would say there was a random mutation and it allows Charles Darwin's argument to move forward because it gives him that initial leap. And once you've got a basic eye, then the eye can evolve and move forward. The question is, can random mutation on its own explain that? And the problems you're going to have are going to be brutally obvious as we try to go forward. Again, I think the answer is no. But as we look at this, again, and I'm going to quote from Darwin here real quick and looking at this problem, he says, the simplest organ, which can be called an eye, consists of an optic nerve surrounded by pigmented cells and covered by translucent skin, but without any lens or other refractive body. Okay, I understand that. Again, we're granting a lot at this point. So we have to grant him at this point. Let's think about what we've got before that we have to give him. Number one, of course, we have a brain, and we have to have nerves that are extending out from the creature's brain that could eventually mutate to form a light-sensitive nerve, that optic nerve that we're beginning with. So we're granting him an enormous amount, assuming that somehow a creature can come up with a brain and then come up with functioning nerves that are sending information to that brain. That's a long ways down the evolutionary path that we're having to grant Charles Darwin to get to that point. Then we have to have, of course, this idea that the organ would be beneficial to the creature. Otherwise, by his own theory, that natural selection would wipe out any non-useful body parts. We've talked about this before. How is it that the body is the body patient enough to wait for something that doesn't really function or doesn't function well to grow and function better? Again, we seem to have infused intelligence into this. So again, that's problematic as we look at this. Over time, as we look at this and as we walk forward through it, then you're going to have to start bringing the pieces together. And that's going to be one of the episodes, our next episode, when we talk about irreducible complexity and the problem that we've got there. But if we grant that we've got an optic nerve that suddenly becomes light sensitive, again, that is such a huge and gigantic leap. And I think it probably warrants discussing at this point too. What benefit does light sensitivity have to the creature? The fact that an optic nerve would be sensitive to light is 1,000,000 miles away from an optic nerve that is transmitting visual images. For me as a creature, what is it that I'm going to be able to do with the ability to detect light? For a plant, that might be useful to grow towards the light or something like that. I mean, I get that. But as a creature, as we think about this in the idea of survival of the fittest, what is it that light sensitivity benefits the creature? Again, you're sending data through the optic nerve to the brain, and the first rudimentary eye would be something that would be light sensitive. I mean, okay, but that I don't understand the benefit of that particularly and why the creature is going to hang on to that. But then when you add in the other pieces that he's talking about here, pigmented cells and eventually translucent skin over the eye, we've taken these massive leaps forward. And what you're needing, again, is multiple mutations that are all going on at the same time. And the problem that we've got is each one of these mutations to start the process forward. So we had a creature, and then in the next generation, there was mutation. And so in what started off as just a nerve, at some point there was a random mutation and it became a light sensitive nerve. In our experience, how often do random mutations of DNA, of digital data coding, how often does random mutation of digital coding benefit us versus harm us significantly? I've got an old computer here, and it's funny. This is an old laptop. It was a great laptop in its day. It is gigantic. I'd forgotten how big this thing was. But when I look at this old laptop, the reason I'm not still using it is multiple, obviously. Number one, it's gotten slow over the years, and number two, doesn't work as well as it used to. And let's focus in on number two, although both of those are related to each other. One of the reasons why it's slower, obviously, is just the hardware wearing out and things like that. But the other reason is, within the operating system of this laptop, little changes to the digital coding within that operating system eventually cause it to slow down and then break down. Those little changes are mutations in the digital coding. Changes in coding, little problems in the coding, are never beneficial to us from a computer perspective. We know that. You don't hope for random mutation of your software to get you a better version of software. What you need is intelligence to write you an upgrade, and then you install the upgraded version of the software. And if you ever go out online, I've got an iPhone, if you ever go out online and you notice, why am I installing this upgrade? Inevitably, the first reason is to fix bugs that are in the program. So go ahead and fix program issues that are already in the programming. So we spend half of our time patching apps on our phone to fix problems in the coding. And yet, and again, remember, our coding is ones and zeros. When we look at DNA is comprised of 4 different letters, and it is a computer code remarkably more complex than anything that we've ever tried. The problem I think we run into as we oversimplify this is we look at it and say, well, yeah, there was a random mutation, and we always think of an existing body part that just got better, or an existing body part that grew longer or shorter or whatever it may be, that an arm suddenly became a wing, or in terms of all the Marvel movies out there, that suddenly someone who was a normal person developed wings and they could fly, or they could shoot laser beams out of their eyes, or whatever it might be. But we never actually think about the fact that that doesn't happen at the level of the functioning body part. Mutational changes take place at the level of DNA. So while we recognize that something very simple like this laptop, any changes in its computer coding are devastatingly bad, somehow we get lost and tend to think that mutational changes in our DNA could result in, I don't need my car tomorrow, I could just fly to work. That happens never in our life experience. And so this is the problem that you have with this idea that random mutation combined with natural selection somehow can leap us past the obvious problems that natural selection on its own cannot explain the beginnings of body parts or the beginnings of new creatures. Somehow random mutation is supposed to jump us past that. But in no experience that we have does that end up being the case. And why would we think it might happen when it comes to the most complex thing in the world, which is us? I don't understand where that's supposed to go. And yet over and over again, we're sold that as the idea that this is going to be okay. And that's, I think, the problem that we have here as we're looking at this. Random mutation the vast majority of the time is going to result in a loss of function, not in a gain of new function. We simply do not see, in our experience, and you have to carry this forward into every area of life that we're looking at here. In our experience as it relates to us, random mutation of our DNA, generally speaking, results in problems that we are trying to fix or cure. And some of the fixes that we've come out with in modern medicine are just phenomenal. But as you see changes in medicine starting to focus on actually making drugs down to the level of the patient's specific genetic makeup in an effort to cure the patient of cancer or some genetic illness, when we look at that, we never would say, well, random mutation was a good thing. Random mutation is what we're trying to fix. We're trying to use intelligence to get past random mutation that has caused all these problems to begin with. So in our experience, random mutation is almost always harmful. And yet random mutation, were we to only rely on it once or twice and we say, well, over the course of billions of years, we need a little bit of luck to get us past these things, back to luck again, then you would argue that random mutation could somehow explain that. The problem is, if you look at us as creatures, over and over and over again, random mutation is going to be needed to leap hurdle after hurdle after hurdle. And it just simply lacks the explanatory ability to do so when we consider that random mutation is going to have to take place at the level of DNA, at the level of coding inside of us. And we know that coding changes do not result in good things. Coding changes are almost always entirely bad, if not always entirely bad. So I understand the theory, and I wanted to expand on this a little bit more before we start working our way into the idea of irreducible complexity. But as we look at this and walk forward through it, I don't understand, there's not a scientific path going forward where natural selection on its own can't explain these things, and so random mutation can logically jump us past that. When we look at what random mutation can actually do in our experience, there's no arena to believe that that is the case. And were it the case once, you could say, well, we got lucky in that one time it happened, but you're going to need that to be the case over and over and over and over again for every enormous leap forward that we have for us as a species or any other species. If you just think about it, working your way down, vision, hearing, smell, taste, balance. We're going to talk about balance in a couple of episodes and what a sneaky little problem that is for Charles Darwin. Movement, functioning body parts like swimming or walking or moving or using your arms for lifting, fingers. I mean, all of these changes, all of these body parts that you think of, legs and arms and elbows and opposable thumbs and all of the things that we tend to take for granted. Random mutation, does it really explain any of them? In our experience, do we see situations where we see random mutation on its own can explain that? I understand that we can evoke those changes through intelligence and tinkering with DNA, but that again argues for the contrary. If you look at the situation and say, well, we can change DNA through intelligence, that would point us to an intelligent creator, not to random mutation helping natural selection along in this process. So before we go any further, I'm going to keep this episode short, and I want to keep the next episode a little bit short as we really start then breaking down some examples of this. But again, as we look at this, how is it that mutation, random mutation added to natural selection actually gains us much of anything? In our experience, as we look at this, I think every single time we recognize random mutation to be an actual bad thing and not a good thing. And certainly one or two examples you might be able to point to, we're looking for an increase in functionality. We're looking for new functionality. We're looking for gains, not losses. And so when we come back to this question of how is it that Darwin's theory can explain the beginnings of a new species, the beginnings of a new function, how can Darwin's theory explain the beginning of that walk up to the top of Mount Improbable? I think you got a lot of problems there, and I don't think it's going to work well. We're going to focus on the eye a little bit more, and in the next episode, what we're going to do is we're going to transition from random mutation and natural selection over to the problem of irreducible complexity, and then we're going to jump and expand tremendously on that in the next episode after that. Thank you so much for joining us this week. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. If you did, I hope you'll consider hitting the like button for the episode and the subscribe button for the podcast. You can find our podcasts on YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify. You can find us on our website at prooftograce.com, and you can reach out to us at prooftograce@yahoo.com if you've got any questions. I hope you enjoyed the podcast, and if you did, I hope to see you next time. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye-bye.